under the ancient yews of St. Mildred's, where shade fell thick and green upon the gravel path, the people of Saint. Mary Mead gathered with the particular solemnity that attends the well-known and recently departed. Mr. Oswald Pritchard lay in his elm coffin, the lid bright with wreaths, lilies from the Women's Institute, a heavy heart of red roses from his widow, and a homely spray of sweet peas from the two Miss Vines, who had once been persuaded, by Mr. Pritchard's unfailing courtesy, to sell their cracked Staffordshire dogs. The vicar, Reverend Paul Denning, read the burial service with a voice at once steady and kind. He had not cared overmuch for Mr. Pritchard's manner at the annual parish meeting, which tended to be decisive at other people's expense, but he had admired his punctuality and his checks. A light breeze lifted the edge of his surplice. He noticed, as he spoke the words, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, that Mrs. Pritchard, the widow, Isabel, youngish for a widow and very fair, stood perfectly upright, her face as smooth and pale as a pearl. Her hands were gloved, her veil rested against her cheeks like a cobweb. The vicar also noticed Miss Jane Marple by the lich gate, slender and composed, a neat figure in a black hat no longer fashionable. Miss Marple had a knitting bag over one arm, incongruous and entirely natural. It was an ordinary village funeral in every way that matters. Murmured sympathies, handkerchiefs discreetly dabbing, the doctor, Lionel Archer, nodding gravely to those familiar with his waiting room, and retired Colonel Hartley clearing his throat too loudly because he could never bear silence. And yet, because Miss Marple's eyes were used to the small things that people do when they think no one is watching, she saw a little thing that no one else appeared to see. A woman, standing just behind the widow, allowed a quick, private smile to touch her mouth as the first shovel of earth struck the coffin lid. It was not cruel, no sneer or smirk, but it was most decidedly a smile, small and satisfied, as one might smile at the exactness of a clock or the successful end of a tiresome errand. She was handsome and well turned out in a suit of clear cornflower blue, with a hat to match and gloves that fitted like a second skin. Miss Marple, who had an unassuming cataloguer's mind, placed the woman at once as Mrs. Lorna Templeton, lately taken the dower house on the lane towards Much Benham, returned from abroad after years in Madeira, with an invalid husband who had left her comfortable and unattached. Miss Marple did not stare. She never stared. She looked instead at a robin on a yew branch, at the scuffed shoe of Colonel Hartley, at a small chip in the edge of the lich gate where boys swung of a Sunday after evensong. She thought, as she often did, of Miss Amy Heddle, who had smiled precisely that way when her sister's betrothal was announced, though in Miss Heddle's case it had been a question, of an aunt's brooch and a stubborn gentleman of property, and this, Miss Marple told herself mildly, was nothing of the kind. Still, human nature has a tendency to repeat itself like an old tune. Phoebe Pritchard, the niece, stood a little apart from her aunt. Her head was down, her eyes swollen in a way that suggested vigils more practical than sentimental. She had done everything, Miss Marple knew, the solicitor's envelopes, the funeral tea arrangements, the black tie for the gardener, Tom Beddoes, who looked scrubbed and unhappy in borrowed jacket and stiff collar. Phoebe's thoughts were unhelpful and mostly lists. Send note to Mrs. Denning about the trestles. Remind Elsie to put the seed cake on the sideboard, not the table. Check the sherry, because lists kept one's mind from other things, such as wills and houses, and the way people say, "Of course you'll be all right," without any evidence. The bell tolled, there were moist handshakes, someone spoke hopefully of the weather improving by Michaelmas. Mrs. Isabel Pritchard thanked the vicar with a faint pressure of fingers. The words, "so good of you to come," fell with gentle accuracy. Mrs. Templeton, in her blue, offered a distilled expression of sympathy that included everyone within range and no one in particular. Her eyes, grey and cool, paused on Miss Marple for the fraction of a second. Grey meets grey, Miss Marple thought, and lowered her gaze to the gravel. "It is very hard," said Mrs. Margaret Denning to Miss Marple as they moved towards the gate. "So suddenly. Though I suppose 71 isn't very suddenly. I can't abide a sudden thing. When my mother died, it was all very tidy, quite expected, and I found that comforting. There must be a kindness in time to prepare oneself." Miss Marple agreed in a soft, general way. "Preparation is, I think, a mercy, though we are rarely offered it." She glanced, without appearing to glance, at Mrs. Pritchard's back, straight and careful, and at the blue suit near it that did not quite keep its distance. After the service, the village flowed along Church Lane as water finds its bed, to the Pritchard house, a respectable square red brick with white sashes and a clipped laurel by the gate. The blinds were half drawn. Inside, the passages smelt of beeswax, lilies, and the faint lemon polish of old wood. On a long table in the drawing-room, ham, thin and pink, cold tongue, mustard, the seed cake that Mrs. Denning had insisted upon, plates of neatly cut sandwiches, and a great silver urn for tea that shone like a trophy. Mrs. Dalrymple, the housekeeper, had a look of gloomy competence, and Elsie, the maid, appeared and vanished with a nervous speed that knocked the crocus-embroidered doily awry each time. There was talk, low and clotted. Colonel Hartley spoke of the late Mr. Pritchard's golf handicap in a voice that suggested unalterable opinion. Dr. Archer watched everything with the expression of a man prepared to be needed. Phoebe poured. Mrs. Pritchard did not eat or drink. She sat and received. Mrs. Templeton made herself useful without seeming to, taking a plate to the vicar's wife, carrying a cup here, retying a ribbon there. Miss Marple, seated near the pianoforte, accepted sweet tea and took a small corner of seed cake to keep up appearances, crumbling it into careful neatness on her napkin. It was then, without warning as these things always appear to be, that a little silence spread outward from the hearthrug as ripples spread from a stone. Mrs. Pritchard, at last persuaded to take a cup of tea, sipped, smiled very faintly at nothing in particular, and set the cup down. Her hand slid on the saucer. Her lips parted. She made a soft sound, no word at all. Then she leaned rather gracefully towards the arm of her chair, as if about to confess some small social sin to the armrest, and did not straighten again. Phoebe's list flew out of her head like birds startled from a hedge. "Aunt Isabel?" She was kneeling, fingers fluttering absurdly, then steadying the widow's shoulder. "Dr. Archer, please." Dr. Archer was already there. He set down his own cup with an exactness that had nothing to do with teacups and much to do with habit. He bent, he looked, he did what doctors do with wrist and eyelid, and he did not say anything for a long second that felt like a minute and might have been less. "Send for—" "No, don't," he said, and then, thinking of the proprieties, added, "Reverend Denning, perhaps, and someone bring a cushion just here." Elsie's hand flew to her mouth. Colonel Hartley said, "Good Lord," as if swearing under orders. Mrs. Denning crossed herself in a way she would later deny. Mrs. Templeton, very calm, moved a footstool aside with an elegant slipper and drew back. Miss Marple rose with the unhurried care of a woman who minds her joints, and because she knew that being in the way is a sin against usefulness, she did not go nearer. She watched instead how people behaved now that something had happened, who sprang forward because they needed to be seen to spring, who hung back because they could not face the sight, who looked at the cup and who at the face. She saw Phoebe's hands, capable hands, tremble and then stop trembling by sheer decision. She saw Dr. Archer's eyes, which were not unkind, widen and then narrow. She saw the vicar, white to the lips, pray with his eyes closed and his mouth set against showing that he prayed. And she saw, quite distinctly, that Mrs. Lorna Templeton's mouth, which had been so composed, changed as if remembering. It did not smile, not this time. It lost its shape for the space of a breath, and in that space there was nakedness, not grief, not shock, but a flash of calculation that might have been fear and might have been something else entirely. The tea cooled. The seed cake sat in prim triangles as if nothing untoward could possibly occur in its presence. Outside, a blackbird sang as though the world. We were not engaged in any human folly. Dr. Archer straightened, and the movements of the room stopped and then began again with a different note in them, like a tune that has slipped into a minor key. "I am afraid," he said gently to Phoebe, who already knew, "that your aunt is gone." He hesitated, then added for the room at large, "It appears to have been very sudden." Miss Marple thought, with the smallest inward sigh, that suddenness is often a veil that people are grateful to draw. She looked at the little circle of moisture on the saucer where the cup had stood. She looked, without seeming to, at the tray and the sugar tongs and the neat little jug of milk with its chip, at the hands that had passed cups and plates, and at the blue sleeve near the mantle with its fine, shining buttons. Human nature, after all, shows itself most plainly when pouring tea. And Miss Marple, who never needed more than that, folded her napkin in two and said nothing at all. The drawing-room emptied with that peculiar mixture of haste and reluctance that follows unexpected death. Dr. Archer spoke quietly to Phoebe about formalities. There would need to be a coroner's inquest, he explained gently, though these things were usually mere routine. Mrs. Denning pressed the girl's cold hand and promised to return in the morning with a casserole, as if cold chicken might somehow restore the natural order of village life. The vicar murmured appropriate words about God's mysterious ways, though his eyes held the troubled look of a man whose faith had been asked to explain too much in too short a time. Miss Marple lingered, as elderly ladies are permitted to do, ostensibly to gather her knitting bag and gloves, but actually to observe the small dramas that unfold when people believe themselves unnoticed. She watched Mrs. Templeton help clear the tea things with an efficiency that spoke of long experience in managing other people's crises. Those blue-gloved hands moved with particular care around the cup and saucer that had been Mrs. Pritchard's, lifting them as one might handle something both fragile and potentially significant. "Such a shock," Mrs. Templeton murmured to Phoebe, who stood pale and rigid by the mantelpiece like a figure carved from ivory. "Your poor aunt seemed quite composed at the service. These sudden turns of the heart, one never knows, does one?" Phoebe nodded without really hearing, her mind already returning to its lists, though these were grimmer now. Undertakers, notices, the dreadful business of sorting through another person's belongings for the second time in a fortnight. She never complained of her heart, she said, more to herself than to Mrs. Templeton. Never complained of anything, really. Miss Marple noted the slight emphasis on anything and filed it away with other small observations. She also noted that Mrs. Templeton's expression of gentle sympathy flickered, barely perceptibly, at the mention of the heart, like a candle, flame touched by an unexpected draught. In the kitchen, where Miss Marple had gone to return her teacup with the quiet helpfulness that makes one invisible, Mrs. Dalrymple was finding relief in righteous indignation. 2 deaths in one house inside a fortnight, she declared to Elsie, whose hands still trembled as she cleared the remaining cups. It's not natural, I tell you. Not natural at all. But the doctor said, Elsie began, her voice wavering. Doctors say what's convenient, Mrs. Dalrymple snapped, then caught sight of Miss Marple and moderated her tone. Begging your pardon, miss, but I've kept house for 40 years, and I know when something's not right. Mrs. Pritchard was no more likely to die of her heart than I am to sprout wings. Miss Marple made gentle, encouraging sounds that invited confidence without seeming to pry. She seemed in good health then. Good health. She was strong as a horse, that one. Never so much as a headache that I knew of. And eating well, sleeping well, I'd have known if she wasn't. It's my business to know. Mrs. Dalrymple's voice dropped to a whisper. But there's been talk, miss. Talk about wills and such. Mr. Pritchard, he was a careful man with his money, but he was generous to those he favoured. And Mrs. Pritchard, well, she knew how to make herself favoured, if you take my meaning. By evening, when the lamps were lit and curtains drawn against the October darkness, St. Mary Mead had thoroughly digested the day's events and was ready to offer its collective wisdom. At the Blue Boar, Colonel Hartley held court with his usual authority on matters he understood imperfectly, but discussed with complete confidence. Mark my words, he declared, tapping the bar with a finger that had once directed artillery. There's more to this than meets the eye. 2 deaths in one family within a fortnight? That sort of coincidence usually isn't. Dr. Archer, nursing a medicinal brandy after his trying day, shifted uncomfortably. The lady died of heart failure, Colonel. These things happen, particularly after sudden shock or prolonged strain. Strain? Colonel Hartley's eyebrows rose sceptically. She didn't look strained to me. Cool as a cucumber throughout the service, almost as if she'd been expecting something. Miss Marple, who had stopped to speak with the landlord about parish matters, found herself an inadvertent audience to this exchange. She thought of Mrs. Pritchard's composure at the funeral, that pearl-like pallor that had indeed seemed remarkably serene for a woman burying her husband. The next morning brought Mrs. Templeton to Miss Marple's cottage, ostensibly to borrow sugar, but actually, Miss Marple suspected, to gauge the villagers' reaction to recent events. She was elegantly dressed in grey wool with touches of white, appropriately subdued, but not quite mourning. "Such a terrible business," she said, settling into Miss Marple's chintz-covered chair with practised grace. "Poor Phoebe is quite beside herself. I've offered to help with arrangements, of course." "How kind," Miss Marple replied, pouring coffee from her best pot. "Though I suppose you didn't know Mrs. Pritchard well, having only recently returned to the village." Something flickered in Mrs. Templeton's grey eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "Actually, I did know her. Rather well, in fact. We were at school together, Miss Pemberton's in Bath. Isabel was Isabel Fairfax then, of course. Quite the rebel, I remember, always in some scrape or other. This was decidedly interesting. Miss Marple offered shortbread from a tin decorated with Highland cattle, and waited. She changed considerably after marriage," Mrs. Templeton continued, her tone carefully neutral. "Oswald Pritchard was a man with very decided views about propriety. But I sometimes wondered if the old Isabel was still there, underneath all that perfect respectability." "And what was the old Isabel like?" Mrs. Templeton turned her coffee cup thoughtfully. "Impulsive, rather careless with money and with people's feelings. She had a way of making promises she couldn't keep and then disappearing when the consequences became uncomfortable." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Phoebe at the post office, looking haggard and overwhelmed. The girl, though at 35 she was hardly a girl, had the hollow-eyed appearance of someone who had slept badly and eaten little. "The solicitor comes tomorrow," Phoebe confided as they walked together toward the Pritchard house, "to read the will. I suppose I should be curious, but honestly, I just want it all to be over." "These things are always difficult," Miss Marple observed gently. "The awful thing is," Phoebe continued, her voice dropping, "I keep feeling I should be sadder. Uncle Oswald was kind to me in his way, and Aunt Isabel gave me a home when my parents died. But they weren't. That is, I don't think they were entirely happy together. There was something strained about it, as if they were both acting parts they'd grown tired of. That evening, as Miss Marple sat with her knitting by the fire, she reflected on the day's revelations. The village was like a pond, she mused. Throw in a stone and the ripples spread outward, touching every shore. The deaths of Oswald and Isabel Pritchard had created such ripples, and in their spreading they revealed hidden currents that ran beneath the surface of everyday life. There was Colonel Hartley's crude, but perhaps not unfounded suspicion. There was Mrs. Templeton's carefully measured sympathy, seasoned with hints of old knowledge and possibly old grievances. There was Phoebe's guilt-tinged relief, and Dr. Archer's professional certainty that might be masking private doubts. And always there was that smile, brief, satisfied, utterly inappropriate, that had flickered across Mrs. Templeton's face as earth struck Oswald Pritchard's coffin. Miss Marple had seen such smiles before, in other places and circumstances. They were the smiles of people who had waited a long time for something, and were pleased to see their patience finally rewarded. The question was, what exactly had Mrs. Templeton been waiting for? And more troubling still, had Isabel Pritchard's sudden death been the answer to that long wait, or merely an unexpected complication in some larger design? Outside, the wind rustled through dying leaves, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour. Miss Marple counted the strokes and returned to her knitting, her needles clicking with the steady rhythm of thought. Tomorrow would bring the reading of the will, and with it, perhaps, some answers to questions the village was only beginning to ask. The morning of the will reading arrived with that peculiar stillness that precedes significant events in small villages. Miss Marple, having completed her morning routine of feeding the birds and checking her small garden, found herself drawn to the village centre by what she would later describe as a sense of things stirring. The post office, as always, served as the village's nerve centre, and Mrs. Jameson behind the counter radiated the satisfaction of one who possessed information others required. "Mr. Wickham arrived from Much Benham not an hour ago," Mrs. Jameson announced to her small but attentive audience. That great black motor of his parked right outside the Pritchard house, very official looking, with his leather case and all. Miss Marple selected a packet of writing paper with careful deliberation, allowing the conversation to flow around her like water around a stone. She had learned long ago that the most valuable intelligence often emerged when one appeared least interested in acquiring it. "I wonder what provisions Mr. Pritchard made," murmured elderly Mrs. Fletcher, adjusting her shopping basket. "Poor Phoebe has devoted herself to that household for years. One hopes such loyalty is rewarded." "Loyalty? Yes," agreed Mrs. Jameson with a meaningful glance, "though I've noticed Mrs. Templeton has been most attentive to Phoebe since the tragedy. Very kind, of course, but one wonders at the sudden interest." Miss Marple filed this observation alongside others she had been collecting. In her experience, sudden displays of kindness following unexpected deaths often revealed as much about the giver's expectations as their generosity. By 11 o'clock, she found herself at the Pritchard house, invited by Phoebe, who had seemed grateful for any familiar presence during the ordeal ahead. The drawing-room had been arranged with formal precision. Mr. Wickham, the solicitor, at the head of the dining table. Phoebe opposite him, pale but composed. Dr. Archer present as family friend, and Mrs. Templeton positioned near the window in her elegant dove-grey suit, appearing every inch the concerned acquaintance. Mr. Wickham's voice carried the dry authority of legal tradition as he began reading Oswald Pritchard's will. The document was, initially, unremarkable, modest bequests to the church and Mrs. Dalrymple, the bulk of the estate to his wife Isabel. But then came the clause that transformed everything. "Subject to her surviving him by a period of not less than 7 days," Mr. Wickham read with professional neutrality. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Miss Marple observed the ripples of reaction. Phoebe's sharp intake of breath, Mrs. Templeton's barely perceptible stiffening, Doctor. Archer's slight frown of professional interest. "As Mrs. Isabel Pritchard died on the 7th day following her husband's death," Mr. Wickham continued, "she did not meet the survival requirement. Therefore, the estate passes to the alternate beneficiary named in the will, Miss Phoebe Pritchard, as Mr. Pritchard's nearest relative." The silence that followed was profound. Phoebe sat frozen, her face cycling through shock, bewilderment, and something that might have been terror at the magnitude of her changed circumstances. This was not the reaction of someone who had anticipated such news, Miss Marple noted. Genuine surprise, she had learned, was difficult to counterfeit convincingly. Mrs. Templeton's response was more subtle but equally revealing. Her composure remained intact, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible adjustment of her posture. It was the reaction of someone whose calculations had been suddenly upset. "Most irregular, Doctor," Archer murmured, though whether he referred to the legal arrangement or the timing of Isabel's death remained unclear. 7 days exactly. What are the odds of such precision? Indeed, Miss Marple thought, what were the odds? In her long observation of human nature, she had learned to be suspicious of coincidences that served someone's interests too neatly. After the formal proceedings concluded, Miss Marple lingered as the others departed, ostensibly to offer Phoebe comfort, but actually to observe the aftermath. She watched Mrs. Templeton approach the newly wealthy young woman with practised sympathy. "My dear Phoebe, such a shock for you. But how wonderful that you're now secure. Your aunt would have been pleased, I'm certain." The words were kind, but Miss Marple detected something calculating in Mrs. Templeton's manner, as if she were rapidly reassessing the situation and Phoebe's place within it. Later, walking home through the village, Miss Marple encountered Dr. Archer near the churchyard. His usual professional confidence seemed shaken, replaced by the troubled expression of a man wrestling with uncomfortable doubts. "Miss Marple," he said, falling into step beside her, "may I ask your opinion on something? In your observation of people, have you noticed how guilt manifests itself?" The question intrigued her. "Guilt takes many forms, Doctor. What troubles you?" Dr. Archer was quiet, for a moment before speaking. "I've been practicing medicine for over 20 years. Mrs. Pritchard's death, the symptoms were consistent with heart failure, certainly. But she was a healthy woman with no cardiac history. When I examined her just weeks ago, her heart was sound. Yet people do die suddenly, even healthy ones. Yes, but usually there are warning signs. Mrs. Pritchard showed none. She seemed almost expectant. And the timing, exactly 7 days. It's as if someone knew about that clause. Miss Marple thought of the teacup, carefully placed, the graceful way Isabel had leaned toward her chair. What might cause such symptoms, Doctor, if not natural heart failure? Dr. Archer hesitated. Certain plant toxins can mimic cardiac arrest. Digitalis, from foxglove, for instance. It grows in many cottage gardens, including the one at the Dower House. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting needles clicking rhythmically as her mind worked through the emerging pattern, a 7-day survival clause that had failed by mere hours, a healthy woman's sudden death at precisely the crucial moment, a school friend who had returned to the village with perfect timing and intimate knowledge of old secrets. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, though the complete image remained frustratingly unclear. But Miss Marple had learned patience in such matters. Truth, like good lace, required careful attention to each thread before the full pattern could emerge, and she was beginning to suspect that someone had been very careful indeed about the timing of recent events. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, she was certain. In her experience, carefully laid plans often unravelled when subjected to the gentle but persistent pressure of village curiosity and an old lady's inconvenient questions. The arrival of Inspector Craddock from Much Benham the following morning brought with it the unmistakable weight of official scrutiny. Miss Marple observed him from her cottage window as his motor car crunched to a halt outside the Pritchard house, a methodical man with steel-rimmed spectacles and the bearing of one who believed that most mysteries could be solved through the proper application of logic and procedure. She had known Inspector Craddock for several years, finding him competent but occasionally prone to accepting the most convenient explanation when a more complex truth lay beneath the surface. His approach to investigation was rather like following a well-marked path through a garden, efficient certainly, but likely to miss the more interesting flowers growing just beyond the borders. By noon, the inspector had established himself in the Pritchard drawing-room with his notebook and methodical questions. Miss Marple, invited by a distressed Phoebe who seemed to find comfort in familiar faces, positioned herself quietly near the window, where she could observe without appearing to do so. "Let us examine the facts systematically," Inspector Craddock began, his voice carrying the authority of official procedure. "Mrs. Pritchard died suddenly at the funeral tea, precisely 7 days after her husband's death. This timing is significant because of a clause in Mr. Oswald Pritchard's will requiring his wife to survive him by exactly that period to inherit. She failed to do so by mere hours." Phoebe sat rigid in her chair, hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white. "I learned about that clause only yesterday, Inspector, with everyone else present." "Yet you had been making inquiries about inheritance law in recent weeks," Craddock continued, consulting his notes. "Mrs. Wickham at the solicitor's office recalls you asking about survival clauses and their legal implications." The colour drained from Phoebe's face. Yes, but that was merely curiosity. Uncle Oswald had been unwell, and I wondered about such matters generally. It wasn't specific to his will." Miss Marple observed this exchange with growing unease. The inspector's questions followed a predictable pattern, each one designed to support a theory he had clearly already formed. In her experience, investigations that proceeded with such certainty often overlooked inconvenient details that might complicate the preferred narrative. Dr. Archer, present as both medical authority and family friend, shifted uncomfortably. "Inspector, I must say that Miss Phoebe's shock at learning of her inheritance appeared entirely genuine. Her reaction was not that of someone who had anticipated such news." "Grief and guilt can produce similar expressions, Doctor," Craddock replied with professional detachment. "Now, regarding the actual method, you mentioned the possibility of digitalis poisoning." "The symptoms were consistent with cardiac glycoside toxicity, Doctor," Archer confirmed reluctantly, "though I stress this is merely speculation pending proper analysis." "And digitalis occurs naturally in foxglove, which grows abundantly in cottage gardens throughout the village," the inspector noted, "including, I'm told, at the Dower House where Mrs. Templeton resides." This observation seemed to surprise everyone present. "Mrs. Templeton, who had been quietly helpful throughout the crisis, raised her eyebrows slightly. "Inspector, surely you don't suspect me of providing poison to poor Phoebe?" "I suspect no one at present," Craddock replied smoothly. "I merely note the availability of the means. However, Miss Pritchard, you alone had both motive and opportunity. You prepared and served the tea, you stood to inherit substantially from your aunt's death, and you had recently been researching the very legal mechanisms that would benefit you. The case against Phoebe was building with damning efficiency. Miss Marple found herself thinking of a similar situation years ago in Little Paddocks, where the obvious suspect had been arrested and nearly convicted before the real murderer's careful planning unravelled. The true killer had understood human nature well enough to predict exactly how the investigation would proceed. Later, when the inspector had departed to continue his inquiries, Miss Marple lingered to offer comfort to the distraught Phoebe. The girl was clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of suspicion falling upon her. "I keep thinking there must be something I'm forgetting," Phoebe said desperately. "Some detail that would explain everything, but my mind feels like cotton wool. I can't seem to think clearly about anything." "That's quite natural after such shocks," Miss Marple replied gently. "Tell me, my dear, had your aunt seemed troubled lately?" "Before your uncle's death, I mean?" Phoebe considered this carefully. "Now that you mention it, yes. She had been receiving letters that upset her greatly. Always in the same handwriting, and she would burn them immediately after reading. The last one arrived just 3 days before Uncle Oswald died. After that, she seemed almost frightened, checking locks, asking Mrs. Dalrymple odd questions about whether anyone had been asking after her." This was most interesting. Miss Marple made a mental note to explore this avenue further. In her experience, mysterious letters that caused distress often held keys to understanding subsequent events. That evening, as she tidied the drawing room where the tragic tea had taken place, Miss Marple's attention was caught by a small detail others had overlooked. Caught on the underside of the serving tray's handle was a tiny thread, bright cornflower blue, no longer than a fingernail paring. She thought immediately of Mrs. Templeton's elegant blue suit, worn to the funeral with such striking appropriateness. The thread might mean nothing, of course. Such things caught everywhere. But Miss Marple had learned to pay attention to small inconsistencies, particularly when they involved people whose behaviour had already struck her as noteworthy. Walking home through the gathering dusk, she reflected on Inspector Craddock's investigation. His theory was neat, logical, and addressed all the obvious questions, but it left too many loose ends. Mrs. Templeton's inappropriate smile at the funeral, her intimate knowledge of Isabel's past, the mysterious letters that had so disturbed the deceased woman in her final days. Most troubling was the inspector's eagerness to accept the first plausible solution rather than examining the evidence more carefully. Real murderers, in Miss Marple's considerable experience, were usually more subtle than this case suggested. They understood the value of misdirection, of ensuring that suspicion would fall naturally on someone else. As she prepared her evening tea, Miss Marple found herself thinking that someone had been very clever indeed about timing and motive. But cleverness, she had observed, often contained the seeds of its own destruction. The more elaborate the deception, the more likely it was to contain some small flaw that would ultimately expose the truth. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a visit to the Dower House. It was time to have a proper conversation with Mrs. Templeton about old friendships, cottage gardens, and the curious timing of her return to St. Mary Mead. The following morning brought one of those crisp October days when autumn shows its finest face, and Miss Marple decided that a constitutional walk past the Dower House would be both healthful and informative. She carried a small basket containing a jar of her gooseberry preserves, providing the perfect excuse for a neighbourly call. The Dower House sat prettily behind its hedge of copper beech, its Georgian windows catching the morning sun with quiet elegance. Mrs. Templeton was in her garden, dead-heading the last roses with practised efficiency. She looked up at Miss Marple's approach with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased, though her eyes held that watchful quality Miss Marple had begun to associate with her. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you. I was just thinking how melancholy the garden looks now that the season's turning." She gestured toward a particularly robust clump of foxgloves near the back border, their spotted bells still magnificent despite the advancing season. "Though some plants seem to thrive in this weather." "Would you care for some coffee? I've just made a fresh pot." They settled in a charming morning room overlooking the garden, where late roses still bloomed against the mellowed brick wall. Mrs. Templeton poured coffee from delicate spode china, her movements graceful and controlled. "Such a trying time for poor Phoebe," she observed, her voice carrying appropriate concern. "To lose both aunt and uncle so suddenly, and now to face these dreadful suspicions. Though I suppose the inspector must investigate thoroughly." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, accepting her cup with careful attention. "Though I've always found that the most obvious explanations are sometimes the least accurate. Human nature is rarely as straightforward as it appears." Something flickered in Mrs. Templeton's grey eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "You don't believe Phoebe is guilty?" "I believe that grief and shock can make innocent people appear guilty of things they haven't done." Miss Marple sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Tell me, did you know Mrs. Pritchard well during your school days? You mentioned you were at Miss Pemberton's together." Mrs. Templeton's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her cup handle. "We were friends, yes, though Isabel was rather difficult to know truly." She had secrets even then, little deceptions that seemed harmless until they caused real hurt. "What sort of deceptions?" "Oh, the usual schoolgirl things at first. Borrowed items that were never returned, promises made and broken, confidences betrayed when it suited her purposes." Mrs. Templeton paused as if debating how much to reveal. "But there was one incident that rather defined our relationship. She took something of mine, a locket that had belonged to my mother. When confronted, she claimed it was hers, that I was mistaken. The headmistress believed her, of course. Isabel was always very convincing." Miss Marple made sympathetic sounds while noting the edge of old bitterness in Mrs. Templeton's voice. "How distressing for you." "It was more than that, I'm afraid. The locket was valuable, and its loss affected my family's financial situation considerably. My father had to withdraw me from school earlier than planned." Mrs. Templeton's composure never wavered, but her eyes held a coldness that hadn't been there moments before. Isabel had a talent for making others pay for her desires. As they continued talking, Miss Marple's attention was caught by something glinting in the morning sunlight on the carpet near Mrs. Templeton's chair. She leaned forward slightly, ostensibly to admire a photograph on the side table, and saw what appeared to be a small button, bright cornflower blue enamel with a delicate silver rim, exactly the sort that might grace an expensive suit. "What a lovely photograph," Miss Marple commented, though her mind was working rapidly. "Is that your late husband?" Mrs. Templeton followed her gaze, and in doing so noticed the button herself. Her composure never wavered, but Miss Marple caught the slight stiffening of her shoulders, the almost imperceptible pause before she reached down to retrieve the errant fastening. "How careless of me," Mrs. Templeton murmured, slipping the button into her pocket with practised casualness. "These decorative buttons aren't sewn on as securely as they might be. I must have lost it when I changed clothes yesterday." But Miss Marple had observed that Mrs. Templeton's current ensemble, a brown wool dress with horn buttons, bore no resemblance to the elegant blue suit from the funeral. More significantly, she remembered quite clearly that all the buttons on that blue suit had been intact when Mrs. Templeton left the Pritchard house after Isabel's death. The conversation continued pleasantly enough, touching on village matters and mutual acquaintances, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She was thinking of that blue thread caught on the serving tray, of the careful way Mrs. Templeton had handled the teacups, of the satisfied smile that had crossed her face as earth struck Oswald Pritchard's coffin. When Miss Marple rose to leave, Mrs. Templeton walked her to the garden gate with every appearance of friendly concern. "I do hope this dreadful business is resolved soon," she said, her hand resting lightly on the latch. "Poor Phoebe needs peace to grieve properly." "Indeed she does," Miss Marple agreed, "though I suspect the truth will emerge in its own time. It usually does, in my experience. Small things have a way of revealing themselves when we least expect it." For just a moment Mrs. Templeton's mask slipped, and Miss Marple glimpsed something cold and calculating beneath the surface warmth. Then the moment passed, and she was once again the concerned neighbour expressing appropriate sympathy. Walking home through the village, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's discoveries. A button that shouldn't have been where it was, connecting elegance to crime, the revelation of old grievances that had festered over decades. Most telling of all, the reaction of someone who had just realized that her careful planning might not have been quite as perfect as she had believed. That evening she sat by her fire with her knitting, working through the implications of what she had learned. The blue button was significant not just as physical evidence, but as proof that Mrs. Templeton had been more intimately involved in the events of that tragic afternoon than she had claimed. Combined with the thread on the serving tray and her knowledge of the will's provisions, a pattern was emerging, one that spoke of careful planning, patient waiting, and the cold-blooded execution of a long-delayed revenge. The question now was how to prove it, and more importantly, how to ensure that an innocent young woman didn't pay the price for someone else's carefully orchestrated crime. The morning after her discovery of the blue button, Miss Marple approached her investigation with the methodical patience of one who understood that truth, like good bread, required proper rising time. She began with Mrs. Dalrymple, who had requested a private word about matters that had been troubling her conscience. "I've been thinking about that afternoon," Mrs. Dalrymple began, settling into Miss Marple's comfortable parlour with obvious relief. "About the tea service, specifically. Mrs. Pritchard was always particular about her cup, the one with the little rosebuds. Never used anything else for her afternoon tea, but that day, when I looked later, she'd been drinking from one of the plain white ones." Miss Marple poured tea from her best china, noting how Mrs. Dalrymple's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the cup. How curious. Did someone else prepare her tea? That's just it. Mrs. Templeton was being ever so helpful, hovering about the kitchen, offering to carry things. She even rearranged the cups on the tray, said she was making sure everyone had fresh ones. Mrs. Dalrymple's voice dropped to a whisper. "And there's something else." Those letters that had been upsetting Mrs. Pritchard, I recognized the handwriting. It was the same as the note Mrs. Templeton sent when she first inquired about renting the Dower House. Very distinctive, with those elaborate capital letters. This connection sent a small thrill through Miss Marple's consciousness. The letters distressed Mrs. Pritchard considerably. Oh yes, terribly. She'd go quite pale after reading them, then burn them immediately in the grate. The last one came 3 days, before Mr. Pritchard died, and after that she seemed almost frightened. Asked me odd questions about whether anyone had been asking after her, whether I'd noticed strangers about the house. After Mrs. Dalrymple departed, Miss Marple made her way to the kitchen garden where Tom Beddoes was working among the winter vegetables. The big man looked up with the expression of someone carrying a burden too heavy for comfortable silence. "Miss Marple, I've been wanting to speak with someone sensible about Miss Phoebe's troubles," he said, straightening with obvious relief. "There's things I saw that don't sit right with what folks are saying." "I'm always willing to listen, Tom." "It's about Mrs. Templeton and Mrs. Pritchard. I saw them talking in the yew walk, 3 evenings before Mr. Pritchard died. Voices raised, they were. Mrs. Pritchard said something about having paid enough already, and Mrs. Templeton replied that she'd pay what she owed or be stripped of everything she prized. Tom's weathered face creased with concern. Then they saw me and went quiet, but the air between them was poisonous. Miss Marple made encouraging sounds, and Tom continued. "The day before the funeral, Mrs. Pritchard asked me to pull up all the foxgloves by the kitchen path, said they were dangerous plants and she'd feel safer with them gone. Strange request, miss, seeing as they'd been there for years without bothering anyone. And did you remove them?" "I did, though it seemed a shame. Beautiful plants, foxgloves, but I suppose they are poisonous if you don't know how to handle them properly." Miss Marple's next call was to Dr. Archer, whom she found in his surgery reviewing medical journals, with the absorbed attention of one seeking answers to troubling questions. "Doctor, you mentioned that Mrs. Templeton had experience caring for an invalid husband in Madeira. Would such experience include knowledge of medications?" Dr. Archer looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Certainly. Caring for a chronic invalid requires considerable understanding of dosages, timing, and drug interactions. Mrs. Templeton would have learned a great deal about the effects of various medications." He paused, then added quietly, "including, potentially, the precise timing required for digitalis to prove fatal." "The timing could be calculated that precisely?" "With sufficient knowledge, yes. The onset of symptoms can be predicted within a reasonable margin, particularly if one understands the victim's physical condition and has observed their reactions to stress. Dr. Archer's voice grew troubled. Mrs. Pritchard's death occurred at almost exactly the moment when the will's survival clause would fail. That level of precision suggests either remarkable coincidence or very careful planning. The Miss Vines encountered at their haberdashery provided the final piece of physical evidence Miss Marple required. The elderly sisters possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of clothing and an eye for detail that rivaled any professional investigator. "That beautiful blue suit of Mrs. Templeton's," Miss Vine observed, threading a needle with practised precision. "Such elegant buttons, little enamel ones with silver rims. Very expensive. I noticed them particularly at the funeral because we'd had similar ones in stock years ago." "All the buttons were present when she arrived at church?" "Oh yes, definitely. I always notice such things. A woman of her refinement wouldn't appear in public with a missing button." Miss Vine paused thoughtfully. "Though I can't say I observed her closely when she left the Pritchard house later." There was such confusion with poor Mrs. Pritchard's collapse. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern emerging from these accumulated observations. The threatening letters in Mrs. Templeton's distinctive handwriting, the careful switching of teacups during the funeral tea, the removal of foxgloves from one garden while they flourished abundantly in another, the precise timing that suggested intimate knowledge of both the will's provisions and digitalis toxicology. Most telling of all was the psychological portrait taking shape, a woman who had nursed grievances for decades, who possessed both the knowledge and opportunity to act, and who had positioned herself perfectly to deflect suspicion onto an innocent victim. The blue button found at the dower house, combined with the thread caught on the serving tray, painted a picture of someone who had been more intimately involved in the afternoon's tragic events than she had claimed. Mrs. Templeton's helpful presence during the tea preparations now appeared in a far more sinister light. As Miss Marple prepared her evening meal, she considered the delicate task ahead. The evidence was accumulating, but it remained largely circumstantial. What she needed was a way to encourage Mrs. Templeton to reveal herself through her own actions and words. In Miss Marple's long experience, the guilty often betrayed themselves when they believed they were perfectly safe, particularly when their vanity was subtly engaged. Tomorrow, she decided, would be the appropriate time for a more direct approach, not a confrontation, which would only put Mrs. Templeton on guard, but a carefully orchestrated social situation where human nature might reveal what careful planning sought to conceal. The Women's Institute meeting convened that Thursday afternoon in the village hall with its usual mixture of charitable purpose and gentle social competition. Miss Marple arrived with a basket of knitted scarves for the autumn jumble sale, noting with quiet satisfaction that the gathering provided exactly the sort of innocuous social setting where human nature revealed itself most clearly. The hall buzzed with familiar activity. Mrs. Denning marshalled volunteers with military precision. The Miss Vines presided over their domain of buttons and thread with regal authority, and Phoebe Pritchard, pale but determined, sorted through donations with the mechanical movements of someone grateful for any distraction from her troubles. Mrs. Templeton moved among the tables with her characteristic grace, offering assistance with the practised ease of one accustomed to making herself indispensable. Miss Marple positioned herself near the tea station, ostensibly to help with the afternoon refreshments, but actually to observe the small dramas that unfolded when people believed themselves unnoticed. She watched Mrs. Templeton arrange the sugar cubes in the bowl with particular attention, alternating their positions in a precise pattern. One cube set square, the next turned on its point, creating a pleasing geometric design that spoke of a mind that found comfort in order. "Such a lovely pattern," Miss Marple commented mildly, causing Mrs. Templeton to glance up with a brief flicker of something that might have been surprise. "Oh, just a little habit of mine," Mrs. Templeton replied, with her practised smile. "I find that neat arrangements make everything more pleasant, don't you think?" When tea was called, the ladies gathered with the grateful relief of those who had earned their refreshment through good works. Mrs. Dalrymple, who had insisted on attending despite her recent distress, accepted her cup with visible gratitude. She had always been particular about her sugar. 2 lumps, no more, no less, and reached for the bowl with the automatic gesture of long habit. Miss Marple watched with the trained eye of one who had learned to notice small things. Mrs. Dalrymple selected 2 cubes from the top layer of Mrs. Templeton's careful arrangement, dropped them into her tea, and stirred with her usual brisk efficiency. She raised the cup, took a generous sip, and paused with a slight frown. "Odd taste," she murmured, then took another sip as if to confirm her impression. "Rather bitter." The words died on her lips as her face went suddenly slack. The cup slipped from her fingers, clattering against the saucer as her hand lost its strength. The familiar silence of crisis spread through the hall as Mrs. Dalrymple swayed in her chair, her breathing becoming laboured and irregular. Dr. Archer, summoned by someone's quick thinking, arrived within minutes to find the housekeeper unconscious but breathing. "Fetch milk," he ordered tersely, his examination revealing the telltale signs of poisoning. "And someone call for the ambulance from Much Benham." Miss Marple, while others fussed and exclaimed, quietly examined the sugar bowl. The top layer maintained its precise alternating pattern, but she noticed that 2 of the remaining cubes caught the light differently, as if they had been treated with some substance that had dried to near invisibility. A delicate coating, perhaps, that would dissolve slowly enough to allow the poison to take effect after consumption. Mrs. Templeton's reaction was perfectly calibrated, concerned but not panicked, helpful without being intrusive. She moved the sugar bowl aside with the natural gesture of someone clearing space for the doctor's work, but Miss Marple caught the brief moment when her fingers brushed against the evidence with what might have been satisfaction. "Such a terrible coincidence," Mrs. Templeton murmured to the assembled ladies. "First poor Mrs. Pritchard, now this. One begins to wonder if there's something affecting the whole village." Inspector Craddock arrived as Mrs. Dalrymple was being loaded into the ambulance, his expression grim with the realization that his neat theory about Phoebe's guilt had developed uncomfortable complications. The presence of a second victim, particularly one who had been vocal about her observations regarding the fatal tea service, suggested a pattern of silencing witnesses that his preferred suspect seemed incapable of orchestrating. "The sugar cubes," Miss Marple mentioned quietly to Dr. Archer as the inspector questioned the other ladies. "I believe you'll find that some of them have been treated with something that would account for Mrs. Dalrymple's symptoms." Dr. Archer examined the remaining cubes with professional interest, noting the subtle differences in their surface texture. Digitalis most likely applied as a coating that would dissolve gradually. Whoever did this has considerable knowledge of both the poison's effects and Mrs. Dalrymple's habits. The afternoon's events marked a turning point in the investigation. The attack on Mrs. Dalrymple, crude compared to the sophisticated timing of Mrs. Pritchard's death, revealed a killer growing desperate to silence inconvenient witnesses. More significantly, it demonstrated a mind that found comfort in patterns and precision, even when committing acts of violence. Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, her thoughts occupied with the image of those carefully arranged sugar cubes, and Mrs. Templeton's satisfied expression as she moved the bowl aside. The killer had revealed herself more clearly than she realized, not just through her actions, but through her compulsive need to impose order on chaos. The failed attempt had also created something the killer hadn't anticipated, a surviving witness who could testify to the deliberate nature of the attack. Mrs. Dalrymple's recovery would provide crucial evidence, but more importantly, it would force the killer into increasingly desperate measures. As Miss Marple prepared her evening tea, she reflected that murderers who planned with such meticulous care often contained the seeds of their own destruction. The very precision that had made the first crime so nearly perfect now served as a signature that pointed inexorably toward its author. Tomorrow, she decided, would be the appropriate time for her own carefully orchestrated social gathering, one designed to provide Mrs. Templeton with enough rope to hang herself with her own clever arrangements. The morning brought encouraging news from Much Benham Hospital. Mrs. Dalrymple had regained consciousness and was asking specifically to speak with Miss Marple about something important regarding the sugar arrangement. This development, Miss Marple reflected, as she penned her invitations, would undoubtedly create considerable anxiety for someone who had believed their second victim safely silenced. Her invitations were models of innocent purpose. To Mrs. Templeton, She wrote of a quiet gathering to discuss Mrs. Dalrymple's recovery and put recent troubles in proper perspective. Phoebe received comfort disguised as courtesy, a peaceful hour away from all the dreadful business. Dr. Archer was invited for his medical insights, while Inspector Craddock received a more intriguing note suggesting that certain patterns might become clearer in informal surroundings. By 3 o'clock, Miss Marple's cottage parlour had been arranged with particular attention to psychological detail. The tea service was laid on her finest lace cloth, each cup positioned with deliberate care. A blue enamel button with silver rim, the twin to the one found at the Dower House, rested casually among the sewing notions on the mantelpiece, catching the afternoon light with innocent gleam. Most significantly, the sugar bowl sat centred on the tray, its contents arranged in the same alternating pattern Mrs. Templeton had unconsciously created at the Women's Institute. One cube placed square, the next turned on its point, creating the geometric precision that seemed to comfort a mind that imposed order even while committing murder. Mrs. Templeton arrived first, elegant in charcoal grey with pearl buttons, her movements carrying their usual controlled grace. Her eyes swept the room with the practised assessment of one accustomed to evaluating domestic arrangements, lingering momentarily on the sugar bowl with what might have been professional appreciation. "How thoughtfully prepared," she murmured, settling into the chair Miss Marple indicated, positioned to provide a clear view of the mantelpiece. "You have such an eye for proper arrangement." Phoebe arrived looking wan but grateful for distraction, followed by Doctor Archer with his air of quiet competence, and finally Inspector Craddock, whose expression suggested sceptical curiosity about this unconventional investigative method. "I thought we might discuss Mrs. Dalrymple's remarkable recovery," Miss Marple began, pouring tea with ceremonial precision. "She's been most helpful in clarifying certain details that had puzzled me about recent events." She passed the sugar bowl first to Mrs. Templeton, watching with the trained eye of one who had learned to read human nature in its smallest gestures. Mrs. Templeton's hand hovered briefly over the irregular arrangement, then, with unconscious compulsion, began aligning the cubes, one square, one pointed, restoring the comforting pattern even as she selected her portion. "Poor Mrs. Dalrymple," Mrs. Templeton replied smoothly, dropping 2 precisely arranged cubes into her cup, though I wonder how reliable her observations might be given her obvious distress. "Oh, but she was quite specific," Miss Marple continued gently, "particularly about the rearrangement of teacups on the afternoon Mrs. Pritchard died. She remembered your kindness in ensuring everyone had fresh cups." The words fell into a silence pregnant with unspoken implications. Inspector Craddock leaned forward with renewed interest, while Dr. Archer set down his cup with deliberate care, his medical training alert to the psychological currents flowing through the room. "I was merely being helpful during a difficult time," Mrs. Templeton said, her voice carrying exactly the right note of injured dignity, though Miss Marple caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "Indeed, your helpfulness has been remarkable," Miss Marple agreed warmly. "It reminded me of something that had been troubling me, your particular attention to arrangements. The way you organized those sugar cubes at the Women's Institute, for instance, such a distinctive pattern." She gestured toward the sugar bowl, where the cubes maintained their precise alternating arrangement. Mrs. Templeton's gaze followed involuntarily, and for just a moment her composure flickered to reveal something calculating beneath. "You have a remarkable memory for trivial details," Mrs. Templeton observed, but her tone had acquired an edge that hadn't been there moments before. "Age teaches one to notice patterns," Miss Marple replied mildly, "in behaviour, in events, in the small habits that reveal character. For instance, the way certain people arrange objects when concentrating on other matters. It becomes quite unconscious, like a signature." Her knitting needles clicked softly as she worked, the rhythm matching her careful words. "There's also the matter of distinctive handwriting." Mrs. Dalrymple mentioned recognizing the hand that wrote those distressing letters to Mrs. Pritchard. "Very particular capital letters," she said. Mrs. Templeton's teacup touched its saucer with a faint click, the sound sharp in the gathering tension. Her breathing had become shallow, though her outward composure remained intact. "And then there's timing," Miss Marple continued thoughtfully. 7 days exactly. What are the odds of such precision without careful calculation? particularly when combined with intimate knowledge of both digitalis effects and legal requirements. The psychological trap was closing with gentle but inexorable pressure. Mrs. Templeton sat perfectly still, but Miss Marple observed the telltale signs: the pulse at her throat, the almost imperceptible adjustment of posture, the way her eyes kept returning to that blue button on the mantelpiece. "Of course," Miss Marple added with deceptive casualness. "Patterns sometimes reveal themselves in unexpected ways. A thread caught on a serving tray, a button found where it shouldn't be, the compulsive need for order even in moments of greatest stress." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle tick of the mantel clock and the soft click of Miss Marple's knitting needles. Mrs. Templeton's mask of polite interest had become rigid, her grey eyes holding a coldness that spoke of calculations rapidly being revised. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting—" "I'm merely observing human nature, Inspector," she interrupted gently. "How people reveal themselves through their habits, particularly when they believe themselves unnoticed. The question is whether recognition leads to acknowledgement or merely to more desperate measures." The challenge hung in the air like morning mist, and Miss Marple waited with the infinite patience of one who had set her trap and now watched for the inevitable moment when human nature would spring it closed. The silence stretched taut as a wire, broken only by the gentle tick of Miss Marple's mantel clock and the soft click of her knitting needles. Mrs. Templeton sat frozen in her chair, her grey eyes darting between the blue button on the mantelpiece and the precisely arranged sugar cubes, her composure beginning to fracture like ice under spring sun. "It began for me," Miss Marple said at last, her voice carrying the gentle authority of absolute certainty, with a smile. "Not the gracious expressions of sympathy you've shown since, Mrs. Templeton, but that small, private smile at Mr. Pritchard's funeral, just as the first earth struck his coffin. It was satisfaction, pure and simple. The smile of someone whose long patience was finally bearing fruit." Mrs. Templeton's hand smoothed her skirt with compulsive precision, but she remained silent. "You see, I've observed that human nature reveals itself most clearly in unguarded moments. That smile told me someone had been waiting for Mr. Pritchard's death, not grieving it, but welcoming it as an opportunity." Miss Marple's needles continued their rhythmic dance. The question was, opportunity for what? Inspector Craddock leaned forward, his notebook forgotten, while Dr. Archer watched with the fascination of one observing a masterful diagnosis unfold. "The answer lay in understanding the true motive," Miss Marple continued. "Everyone assumed the inheritance was the prize, but you knew better. You understood that 7-day survival clause perfectly. Your goal wasn't to gain the Pritchard fortune, it was to ensure that Isabel Pritchard lost it." She gestured toward the sugar bowl with its alternating pattern. "You have a mind that finds comfort in order, Mrs. Templeton. Even under stress, you arrange things precisely. Sugar cubes, teacups, even murder. At the Women's Institute, you unconsciously created this exact pattern while attempting to poison Mrs. Dalrymple. It was your signature, as distinctive as handwriting." Mrs. Templeton's breathing had become shallow, her elegant facade beginning to crack. "The threatening letters were your opening gambit, written in that distinctive hand Mrs. Dalrymple recognized from your rental inquiry. They served dual purposes, frightening Isabel while gathering intelligence about her habits and fears. When she told you in the U-Walk that she'd paid enough already, you replied that she'd pay what she owed or be stripped of everything she prized. And so she was." Miss Marple reached for her teacup, noting how Mrs. Templeton's eyes followed the movement with predatory intensity. "On the funeral afternoon, your helpfulness in the kitchen provided the perfect cover. You switched the cups. Mrs. Dalrymple noticed Isabel didn't have her usual rosebud pattern. The plain white cup you'd prepared contained digitalis, applied to the rim in a dose calculated to take effect at precisely the right moment." "This is pure speculation," Mrs. Templeton said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Oh, but there's physical evidence too." Miss Marple indicated the blue button on her mantelpiece. "This morning I found its twin on your carpet. Curious, since the Miss Vines confirmed all your buttons were intact at the funeral. You must have lost it during your careful preparations, perhaps when it caught on the serving tray." She held up a small cornflower blue thread. "This was found on that same tray, matching your funeral suit perfectly. Combined with your knowledge of digitalis, gained through years of caring for an invalid husband, and your intimate understanding of the will's provisions, the pattern becomes unmistakable." The psychological pressure had reached its breaking point. Mrs. Templeton rose abruptly, her composure finally shattering completely. "She deserved it," the words erupted with decades of suppressed rage. "Isabel Fairfax destroyed my life at school, stole my mother's locket, convinced everyone I was lying, cost my family everything. Then she ruined my engagement to Harold Templeton for the sheer pleasure of proving she could." Her voice carried the bitter precision of long-nursed grievances. 20 years I spent in Madeira, learning about poisons while caring for a man who never loved me. When he died, I knew exactly how to spend my freedom. Isabel had everything: wealth, position, security. But she also had vulnerabilities I could exploit. "The 7-day clause was perfect," she continued, her mask completely fallen. "Let her inherit first, then die just hours too late to keep it. Poetic justice for someone who'd spent her life taking what belonged to others." Inspector Craddock rose, his duty clear. "Lorna Templeton, I arrest you for the murder of Isabel Pritchard and the attempted murder of Mrs. Dalrymple." Mrs. Templeton straightened, her elegance returning even in defeat. She looked at Miss Marple with something approaching respect. "You're very good at reading patterns, aren't you?" I almost succeeded. "Almost," Miss Marple agreed sadly. "But revenge, however carefully planned, carries the seeds of its own destruction. The very precision that made your crime possible also made it recognizable to anyone who understood human nature." As Inspector Craddock led her away, Mrs. Templeton paused at the door. "It was justice, long overdue," she said quietly. "No, my dear," Miss Marple replied with gentle finality. "It was murder. Justice doesn't require such careful arrangements." The door closed behind them, leaving Miss Marple alone with Phoebe and Doctor. Archer, in the sudden quiet of her parlour, where the blue button still caught the afternoon light, a small reminder that truth, like good lace, reveals its pattern to those patient enough to examine each thread. The silence that settled over Miss Marple's parlour after Mrs. Templeton's departure carried the weight of revelation and relief in equal measure. Phoebe sat pale and shaken in the chintz armchair, her hands trembling as she accepted a fresh cup of tea with automatic politeness. The elegant woman who had seemed so genuinely concerned for her welfare had been calculating her destruction with every kind gesture. "I keep thinking I should have seen it," Phoebe whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle tick of the mantel clock. All those helpful suggestions, the way she seemed to understand exactly what I needed to hear. It was all performance. Dr. Archer, who had remained after Inspector Craddock's departure, shook his head with professional gravity. "None of us saw it, my dear. 20 years of planning creates extraordinary skill in deception. The timing alone required intimate knowledge of both digitalis effects and legal mechanisms most of us couldn't comprehend." Miss Marple settled back into her favourite chair, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm, a sound that had become oddly comforting to her guests during these trying days. Evil often wears the most pleasant mask, particularly when it's been refined by patient waiting. Mrs. Templeton understood that the most effective revenge required perfect respectability. The village heals. In the days that followed, St. Mary Mead demonstrated that peculiar resilience of small communities faced with extraordinary circumstances. The initial shock gave way to a more complex processing of events, as neighbours who had welcomed Mrs. Templeton into their midst grappled with how thoroughly they had been deceived. Mrs. Dalrymple recovered with the stubborn determination of one who had survived worse than poison and refused to grant death the satisfaction of victory. She returned to her duties at the Pritchard house with renewed appreciation for life's simple pleasures, though she confided to Miss Marple that city conveniences had begun to sing an interesting song in her ear. "One cannot be expected," she declared over tea and scones, "to go on forever where people fall down dead over refreshments, though I'll stay through Christmas, provided there are no more mysterious arrangements in the sugar bowl. The Pritchard house itself underwent a gradual transformation as Phoebe slowly accepted her changed circumstances. The inheritance that had seemed like a curse became a blessing, allowing her to establish a small school for village children and provide steady employment for Tom Beddoes as groundskeeper. The house that had known such darkness began to echo with young voices and laughter, as if the building itself were grateful to serve life rather than death. Tom's devotion to Phoebe had not gone unnoticed by the more observant villagers, and Miss Marple, watching them work together in the autumn garden, saw the gentle beginnings of something that might bloom into lasting happiness. She did not speak of such observations aloud. It was a mistake she had learned to narrate other people's happy endings before they discovered them for themselves. Justice and memory. Colonel Hartley, never one to admit error gracefully, nevertheless found himself treating Miss Marple with increased respect. "Remarkable bit of detection," he acknowledged grudgingly over sherry at the vicarage, though I maintain there were suspicious elements from the beginning. The Miss Vines reopened their haberdashery with renewed social standing, having discovered that their involvement in solving a murder mystery had considerably enhanced their reputation. They spoke knowledgeably of buttons and threads as criminal evidence, though always with appropriate discretion regarding the more sensational details. Dr. Archer found himself reflecting deeply on the precision with which Mrs. Templeton had calculated her revenge. The experience had shaken his faith in the predictability of human behaviour, leading him to pay closer attention to the small details that revealed his patient's true states of mind. Inspector Craddock, to his considerable credit, visited Miss Marple personally to acknowledge her superior insight. "I was too eager to accept the obvious solution," he admitted, with professional humility. "In future, I'll remember that the most convenient suspect isn't always the correct one." "Human nature rarely follows convenient patterns," Miss Marple replied gently, "but it does follow patterns if one knows how to read them." Quiet wisdom. As November settled over St. Mary Mead, with its familiar rhythm of shortened days and lengthening shadows, Miss Marple often found herself contemplating the case during her evening walks. The dower house stood empty now, its windows dark and its garden returning to wildness. The foxgloves Mrs. Templeton had tended so carefully would bloom again next spring, beautiful and deadly as ever, a reminder that nature, like human nature, contained both creation and destruction in equal measure. The blue button remained on her mantelpiece, a small memento of how the smallest details could unravel the most carefully laid plans. When visitors noticed it, Miss Marple would smile and mention that it reminded her of the importance of paying attention to life's smaller patterns. On quiet evenings by her fire, she would sometimes think of Mrs. Templeton's final words about justice. The woman had genuinely believed her actions were justified, that 20 years of nursing grievances had earned her the right to exact such terrible payment. It was a sobering reminder that the most dangerous criminals were often those who convinced themselves they were righteous. Winter approached with its promise of peaceful evenings and quiet reflection. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily in the lamplight as she worked on scarves for the church jumble sale, each stitch placed with the same careful attention she brought to observing human nature. Outside, the wind rustled through bare branches, and somewhere in the distance the church bell marked the passing hours with its ancient, comforting rhythm. St. Mary Mead slept peacefully under its blanket of stars, secure in the knowledge that justice had been served and truth had prevailed. And in her cottage by the green, Miss Marple smiled softly to herself, content in the understanding that while human nature might be endlessly complex, it was never entirely unpredictable to those patient enough to watch and wise enough to see. The patterns, after all, always revealed themselves in the end.